is this a common quandary for people who find themselves unserved or underserved by conventional banks and start looking for other ways to accomplish what they want to do?
Yes, it's very common, particularly in our current economy where credit is so tight that consumers who are economically disadvantaged or are having trouble raising enough money to get a conventional loan are forced to turn to these alternative types of lenders. Often we've found that there is fraud involved, and the consumer finds themselves paying a lot of money and getting in a situation where they can't succeed.
Leslie, is this a well-monitored, well-watched part of the economy, or is it sort of happening away from the prying eyes of people who enforce the rules?
You know, this has been happening for many years before people really started to pay attention to it, particularly in communities of color. Latino borrowers were getting subprime mortgages often when they could afford a prime loan that would be much safer for them throughout the 2000s. And it was only really in the late 2000s, in 2007, 2008, 2009, where the housing bubble burst and this really came to a head. Before then, when housing prices were rising, when people got into trouble, they could refinance again, or they could sell their home, still losing equity in the process, but there was a way out. When the housing market burst, we see the results now with huge numbers of foreclosures.
Elvis, does the story really start almost 30 years earlier, really, when a lot of barrios, around a lot of neighborhoods around the country saw the departure of conventional banks? Just your plain vanilla branch bank on the corner of a commercial street just sort of went away in a lot of neighborhoods in America.
Yes, I think it did, Ray. And what the problem then became is you have unscrupulous lenders really moving into that area and putting Latinos into a cycle of debt. And one of the problems is that most Latinos don't really understand all the different components that go into these deals. They're told one thing, but when they sign papers, it's really a much different deal. And they're not looking at the fine print. And thus you find them having to refinancing that debt and then slowly beginning this cycle of being indebted at higher and higher interest rates, not understanding what really other recourse they have to really protect themselves. They kind of stay in this, and then it just prolongs it. And it could even be intergenerational, where, you know, the kids, I've heard situations where parents who don't have good credit, but their kids are really moving into that age where they can apply for credit, are usually financing their parents' debt. So now you see that intergenerational debt being transferred over. And so it does become a problem because, as you said, the banks can be regulated, but this area isn't really regulated too much. It's really invisible at the federal level. And so what's going on there is a lot of unscrupulous action that can be dangerous for Latinos and not allowing them to really escape that cycle of debt.
Peter, how did we get here? And in the view of someone who takes the Cato view of the economy and its operation, how do we get out?
I think what economists would say is that the notion of owning a home as a good asset is an odd one. That is, if when you teach students finance theory, you say you ought to have a diversified portfolio, you shouldn't have your assets all in one basket. And notice that what a home is a bet on a particular place in a particular economy in a particular location, and it's the most undiversified asset one could think of. And so
a 30-year bet to boot.
It's odd. And so think about one of our big sources of unemployment right now is all the people who own homes that are below water, that owe more than their mortgage, or owe more on their mortgage than their house value, and yet they fear the wealth loss. They can't deal with it, and they're stuck in Michigan or wherever where there aren't any jobs. And so I'll give myself as an example. I moved 8 times in 10 years during my early career, and I always rented. I didn't buy my first home till I was 45. And I think that's actually sensible. So culturally, we have an odd desire, or we need to change the notion that everyone should own a home and that it's actually a good investment. The real return on housing is basically the rate of inflation over the long run. So minorities in particular shouldn't get caught up in the culture, and they should buy stocks and bonds and invest and rent. That's what I did for most of my lifetime.
Well,